Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Flight Lab Copilot in Action series. Today, we are going to be going into the wonderful unknown of exploring when do we use ERP-based automations, and we'll qualify this a little bit more, versus using agentic or AI automations inside of your organization. This has been a question that we have heard multiple times and even that, for example, at Stone Ridge, our CEO, Eric Newell, and I have actually had a lot of conversation about even more recently as well. So, really looking forward here, team, to actually share a little bit more as to when we should use these and what you should be looking at as a customer to really qualify whether or not you should be using a classical automation that we tackled typically before the age of AI or when we should use AI automation. Because, like we have said before, not everything is a nail, but you may think that you're the hammer for that nail, right? So let's go ahead and dive in here. First things first, just to let everyone know, we will have a copy of this recording. We'll take questions as we go through this. So I'm watching the attendee chat. So say hi, introduce yourself. And at the same time, any feedback that you have as we go through this, please make sure to share it. It just helps us refine and do better, obviously, inside of these sessions over time as well. All right, let's jump into our agenda. So first and foremost, I want this to be well known to everyone that with great power comes great responsibility. If you're a big Marvel fan, Spidey, for example, you know exactly where this comes from. I guess the key thing here is that when we have all these great tools, a lot of us just want to lead with the tools because they're so cool. And I give the analogy of when I was younger in my career, we would sell this solution called Target Business Solutions that was a BI reporting based solution, and it could spin a globe graphically and look amazing. But it was really about the only thing that was really kind of cool about it. And it was a lot of effort and work. And we just sold it because it would spin the globe sometimes. Well, I think in some situations, people have done that with AI. And what I'd like to do is really reframe this for you so that you can obviously focus on what it can and cannot do. So today what we're going to do is we're going to cover things like what is ERP automation? What's the difference between AI and ERP? Why is it so confusing between them? Because you're hearing one thing from people saying you should build autonomous agents, and then you hear maybe your tech team saying, well, why don't we just use Power Automate, for example? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk about how you qualify, and then also what we're also going to do here is show you basically a very simple example, but how drastically different an agentic experience is for building automation versus, for example, an ERP solution. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in and start covering through really the first part here, which is what is ERP automation? So our title might be a little bit misleading, but what I'd classify this as is more just around classic automation. ERP automation, when we look at it through our lens, is going to be our business systems like Business Central, for example, or finance and operations. And I'd even extend this to ERP CRM, right? Sales, customer service, field service. But really, it focuses on what we would automate in the past when we did an implementation. Tooling wise, we have a subset of tools that we use then that basically allows us so that when an event occurs, and that event is typically going to be a data condition or a process flow snap in, or maybe a time based event that allows us basically to go through and do something inside of that business system. Perfect examples of that automation would be when I create an item inside of Business Central, I want it to populate a bunch of variants automatically in the background. This is something that could be tackled with an AI agent, but that automation of what a user would type in might be better served, for example, to be in the ERP capability or using that classical architecture to drive that. The key thing here is that when we look at ERP automation, typically we're looking at highly repeatable, well structured, and well understood data that we're interacting with. Now, I know there's always the devil in the details, right? But this is the commonality or the norm, as I would classify with it, that really drives some of these ERP automation integration scenarios that we would tackle. Whereas with AI automation, of course, because it was the best thing since sliced bread, everything is AI automation. Well, not really, right? AI automation for a concept introduces basically some type of agent that manages and orchestrates the automation need inside of the organization. Now, this is a little bit different because what this means is that you have something that is technically able to identify patterns and generate content, and we use that then to figure out logic-based scenarios that may not entirely conform to what the data came in at, but then does something as we go through that process, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more with that because it's probably clear as mud stating that. But the key thing to note is that agents typically have multiple inputs that start the process, and they are also usually event or time based. Quite candidly, I don't know if the argument anymore of event or time based type scenarios actually influences it. Because when we talk about a business solution versus an agent, everything is going to be an action based off of time, based off of some condition that occurs, based off of some communication. And we could always then basically bring that down to events, time, or process that drive it with either. But I guess the key thing to note here is that the use of large language models is going to be very centric for this process. Whereas within an ERP automation, the example I gave with variants, for example, it would not make sense to have a large language model recommend what we already know we could put in code rapidly to basically address that particular issue. Could it do it? Absolutely, but it would be like basically driving a semi truck as your daily driver to get to work when you actually have a computer job, for example. It's probably not the right tool to use, but you can still do it. So instead of code, the other thing around AI automation is that the way we typically then influence the result is that we use prompts instead of code. Instead of for example, OData, which we use as well typically to interact, for example, with the business system, we use MCP or tools basically inside of an agent. There's different design techniques basically that we use then to address these AI automations, which also means we have to think through then different scenarios that we wouldn't classically think through, for example, with ERP automation. If we go back to that variant example, if I need to create 5 variants and I write that in code to be automated with it, it's always going to create five entries. If I give it to a large language model, based off of the prompt, I might get 6, I might get 4, I might get 3. How often does that occur, right? So once again, this starts to maybe develop in your mind a little bit of the differences between obviously these tools, where one is going to be very focused and the other is going to be very directional. And I think that that's a really important concept to kind of convey as we go through this. Now, some of the core differences, obviously, between these are the fact that typically AI automation really introduces that large language model at the center of the process. The example I love to give with that is Copilot Studio. And I apologize for that. I'm going to put myself to do not disturb in the background real quick. There we go. So, but basically, what happens here is that AI automation, when we think about what it's doing, there's a reasoning type engine on top of it. And I'm not talking about the colloquial AI like ChatGPT with reasoning. I'm thinking about when we give inputs into a large language model, the reason that we can have a large language model make a decision, as we call it, is because the pattern of what it's been trained on in the past reaches that decision. So if we have data and conditions and we give it a question, for example, statistically, this is then what has happened in the past that the model has been trained off of. So that's where we get this type of reasoning, as we call it, so to speak, involved basically with AI automation. The other thing to note around AI automation and where it really excels compared to that of any type of classical automation is the fact that you can bring in large amounts, and large is once again subjective, but large amounts of unstructured data and then be directionally accurate as to what you want to do inside of that process. And this, once again, is just a really important concept. Agents are not 100% accurate all the time. Machine code typically is, right? When we write something with logic, for example, it can typically always be 100% accurate. But an agent, once again, is about that directionality to make a decision to help offset basically some of that work labor. And it may need to, for example, have prompt updates to make it more accurate. But remember, once again, if people have their own autonomy to figure things out and do things, agents kind of do the same thing as people. And we're not always 100% accurate, but does the 90% or 80% or whatever you qualify with it get you basically to your goal? The other thing to know is that ERP automation typically focuses on pro code concepts that orchestrate then low code paths, meaning when I click on an action, I may run some code in JavaScript, for example, in CE, or maybe, for example, in Business Central, I have it in AL, or in F&O, I'm using X++ basically to go through and then define, structure the data, interact with it, and maybe I call a Power Automate through an event or a logic app, for example. But ERP, we're typically starting with code to do something with it. Whereas in the architecture that we have from a Microsoft perspective with Copilot, Copilot is more often low code, no code. Copilot Studio, for example, is the first party app that we use to change or influence Copilot. And we can build agents in Pro Code, obviously using, for example, Foundry and the other Azure tools to do that, such as the bot framework. But once again, that's not what Microsoft is saying for you to use. They're saying Copilot Studio to be able to do that. So once again, there's going to be differences in this ideology of how basically those agents are then built, and then finally how the difference is between that and ERP. And then finally, one of the most major aspects here that influences the output, obviously, of an AI automation need is typically going to be prompts. You have to define descriptions. You have to define the model of what is operating to basically get to the result of what you want. And what do I mean by that? Every variable, you define the description around that variable so the agent has the context of what is stored in that variable. Whereas inside of ERP, you do the variable and maybe you update the documentation, right? Or in your FRD, put that information inside of there. But that variable could be I, and I is just a loop counter. Whereas inside of Copilot Studio, maybe you still name it I, but you put the description as to what that is so that the agent now increments, for example, I, as opposed to, for example, you doing it inside of code to do it. So there's some major differences here, and we're going to actually take this to more of the what I call the low code, no code approaches in this demonstration and discussion, because that's more commonly where we see customers interacting, obviously, with dynamics and business systems to really influence what they want to change, because they may not have JavaScript developers and things of that nature to address their automation needs. Now, the tooling is really important here because once again, when we look at, for example, ERP versus AI automation, there's tools that are used between both of them fairly commonly, and then there are going to be tools that are specific to each of those types of automation needs. So what are those? Well, let's start obviously with ERP tooling, and I'm genericizing this a bit so that way, depending upon if you're on Dynamics, if you're on Infor, if you're on NetSuite, it really doesn't matter. But they will use basically the same core design philosophies around them, which are typically for an automation need that influences an ERP automation need, the event is probably going to happen inside of the system. I say probably because there's always the exception, right? But if I release an order, I want it to generate a notification then to a customer that states, here's the order and here's all the detail related to it. So as you can see here, what happens is inside of a business system, we're typically going to have either an event framework or some type of code that we do to basically start or then influence that process. And I've built a lot of automation. It could be form-based automation. It could be instead of clicking these 5 buttons after I release an order inside of Business Central, I just want AL code that goes through and does those particular actions. Now, the problem with that from an end user perspective, especially for you, is that that's great and it may make a lot of sense. The variance thing, for example, makes a lot of sense where you have consistency with it, but you need to know the tooling and the code, and you need to be able to read that to basically interact with it, which really brings down the number of resources that you can use to address that need. Because remember, it's not just the technology, it's all the also the people that interact with the technology that drive that. Now, other tools that are typically used, obviously, with ERP automation are going to be things like the Power Platform. So Power Automate is really commonly used as well to basically then take a particular action when a business event occurs. You're going to use AI prompts as well on the Power Platform. And then finally, typically, when we look at ERP automation, we look at, for example, maybe we need to use Foundry because we do need to access a large language model or not. We need logic apps maybe instead of Power Automate, or maybe we use Azure functions as well to do code that deciphers something more complex, like identifying qubit requirements inside of a load, so that way we can pack our packages in that particular load in the most optimized manner. So these are different types of tooling that then make sense, obviously, for ERP-based solutions to address those particular needs. And once again, we're looking at the Microsoft stack with this, SAP, Oracle. They're going to have the same type of structure, obviously, that they have around these types of events that occur. Now, the other thing to note, though, is that when we look at AI automation, we start introducing kind of the same tools. So we have the Power Platform. We still use prompts. We still use Power Automate, and we use very typically Dataverse as a backend, which we use in CRM as well. But we introduce concepts in Copilot Studio that are a little bit different than code paths that we do in automation inside of business systems. We give the agent instructions that it lives by. We define topics and tools then that the agent picks. They have their own agency basically. So the agent picks basically what it does. And then also we have knowledge-based repositories that can be fuzzy searched very rapidly compared to that inside of an ERP-based automation, where we may kind of do that in ERP by using what we call regular expressions. You'll hear the term regex used quite a bit, but the net result is that we identify patterns in ERP by doing string searches, whereas Copilot Studio may do things like that to a degree in the back end, but the way that it processes it is entirely different compared to a regular expression. So I think the tooling is really important to note, because for an end user to understand Copilot Studio versus learning AL, Copilot Studio is hands down an easier tool to understand and to build basically automation needs around compared to diving into code. And I get it. Some people are going to argue this as well. I'm a developer and I have been my entire life. So I understand both perspectives with it. But once again, when we look at the number of people that can influence automation needs inside of your business, and the more automation is typically better in a lot of scenarios for you, basically Copilot Studio is where you want to be landing with that to align team for it. But once again, it doesn't mean it's the right tool every single time. So why is this so confusing? Well, let's just get right to it. I think the first thing here is the fact that some of these tools that we have right now are overlapping. Power Automate is a workflow designer where you can have different types of things that occur and different steps that occur as we go through that particular process. And that's just something really important to note, because if you think about it, that tool then is kind of what topics are as we see it inside of Copilot Studio. And you'll see a workflow inside of Copilot Studio for that topic that then calls, for example, Power Automates that are then doing that same thing inside of an automations flow, basically. So I think, once again, that tooling is not really entirely well defined yet as to when one should be used versus the other. I think the other thing here that's really confusing with it is that people look at AI automation through the same lens as ERP automation. And this is a drastically different concept. AI automation is directionally accurate. The way that we make it more exact is typically in AI automation, we call Power Automate flows, for example, that do something more exact, and the agent passes parameters or maybe values to that flow, and then is always consistently running in the same format every single time. But at the same point, that's very similar then to ERP automation, and that takes a lot of time. So in some scenarios, AI automation, you don't even define the flow related to it. You just tell it, write an impactful email that summarizes the context of what we've had in this conversation. Try to do that with an ERP automation. It won't work. It's very hard to do. And I shouldn't say it won't work, but I think you're going to spend way more time doing that than if you just built an agent really rapidly. And I think the other thing here, too, that's really confusing, the market does not help you with your decisions. The market says AI can tackle everything, but the reality is, once again, not everything is a nail. There are some screws on your decking that you have to take care of, for example, and a hammer would not be the right tool then to take care of that. So once again, I think the market has kind of just not defined as well because of this emergent technology as to the exactness of when you should be using one or the other, which has kind of added to this confusion, obviously, as we go through this. So let's kind of demystify that, because I think how you qualify this is where you can have a much more impactful experience now in terms of really what you should be looking for to start that definition journey. So, as an example of how you qualify, one of the very first things I typically talk to individuals around this is the fact that the context of your question should be the guide for you. What does that mean? So when we think about AI automation, we think about the context of what we're going to be interacting with to basically get to the result of what we need in that automation process. So we're still going to have inputs. We're still going to go through a discovery of understanding the role of the person, the type of agent, for example, that might be needed, or automation. And I'll replace agent with automation to start. What are the values? What is the data? How structured is that data? How unstructured is it? How abundant is it? What do we want it to do in that process as we're doing it? And then what also is going to be the output of it? So if your question starts to engage, for example, data sources that are not line level, row level data, for example, that we typically deal with inside of ERP automation, but are PDF documents, that are product specifications, that you want to tailor emails around, for example, to generate something. Well, that is where the context matters, right? The depth of the conversation and what has happened before may influence what that output will be. And the argument would be is that in ERP automation, you can do the same, and you can, but it's a lot more work to get to that. Whereas within a large language model and an agent, they understand what has happened before as it goes through that process, that it can then be used to generate additional content related to it. So the other things to qualify here are that agents, for example, can be stood up very quickly and can deal with what I call fuzzy entrances better. And what does that mean? Well, that means that I don't have to have my data in a perfect condition to basically get the result that I need. Now, the more perfect the data is, the more consistent I can get the results. But once again, we can't always do that, right? If we're on a sales call, for example, and we want our agent to go accumulate information regarding a particular customer by going out to the web to find that information, well, it may not be 100% accurate, but it may actually be better and save time compared to the salesperson going through and doing basically the same action and then getting the directional consistency that they need that an agent would provide as part of that. So I think these fuzzy entrances is another thing to kind of define. What else would be considered fuzzy? Not just raw data that may not be perfect, but also, for example, narratives such as emails or interactions with a chat experience, for example. These are fuzzy where the analysis of the content drives, for example, maybe the decision making, and doing that in code is not a very fun thing to do. So the other thing to note is that ERP automation does require typically more time and effort to define the structure. And once again, this is also a little bit subjective, but here's the main points that I want to present because we see this very commonly as we have customers ask us, well, Scott, should we build a Power Automate to do this, or should we do an agent? Well, an agent can be faster. I mean, substantially faster, depending upon the need and what we're interacting with, compared to that of then, for example, the technical process of building a Power Automate to tackle the same scenario. But, and here's the but, it's not necessarily faster on the discovery, on analyzing the business process, of defining the data inputs that are related to it. You still go through both activities and you save time maybe on the technical side of it, but once again, you still have to go through the same software development life cycles. And let's just dumb it down even further, the process life cycles that you typically talk about with end users to get basically to the result that you want. It's not just about the technical tool to address it. It's about everything else, the testing, the training, the consistency, the what if this doesn't work, what do we do type of a thing that needs to really be thought through. And with an agent, you've got a little bit more leeway then to recover off of those. And we'll talk a little bit more as we show here what I mean by that. And then obviously there are specific markers that you should be looking at that I've mentioned here, such as those fuzzy entrances, such as dealing with a lot of unstructured text data like emails or PDF descriptions, for example. You have, for example, maybe you need to have immediately a response, or when you create a record, it needs to immediately do something. Like those immediacy type scenarios too, an agent is more about taking something offline, like a person in an email, having them think about it and then having them respond. Whereas when we look at ERP-based automations, those may not aid well to that, especially if you need 5 variants set up, because if you do production without those variants set up, you're going to have an issue and you can't wait for an agent to get to that. Instead, you do the automation inside of the business system. So I think these qualification events really help establish that a little bit more. And with that, because we're a Copilot in action, let's go through a scenario. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a scenario in which we will just build the scaffolding. We're not going to build on the fly here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and take an agent approach and a Power Automate approach. 2 different approaches. One classical, which I'll call Power Automate, and then one modern, which I'll call, or AI, I'll call Copilot Studio. And how do we address a scenario where when an email comes in, we want to grab all the data that's in that email. We're going to say that this is a customer creation email where a salesperson can send it to an inbox because they're in the field, for example, so they can't access the business system directly. Instead, they want to send an email with these key attributes of this particular client, and they want it to generate then a record inside of Business Central. And on top of that, they then also wanted to basically send an email confirming that it did do that particular action. So this is really simple, right? We're not going and boiling the ocean, but I want to show the concepts because I think once you see this, it's going to start maybe changing a little bit more of where you can see AI automation just doing a lot better job than ERP automation, or where one may make more sense than the other. So let's do that. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and open up my Power Automate here. Let's start with the classical way of doing it. So Scott, automate that for me, right? Well, let's automate it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my flows, not into my learn. I'm going to go into my flows here and click on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a new flow. And I'm going to do this not using a template because that would be cheating. But what I want to do is I want to build an automated cloud flow. And for our title, we're going to say this is going to be create customer and send email classic, right? We'll set it up as that. So there we have it. Let's go ahead and then I might have to skip that. Then we'll go ahead and come into here and our flow. Then I'm going to put it up there. So once again, here's our designer. This isn't rocket science, right? This is pretty easy to understand. Great. Let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to add a trigger, right? So now what I need to do is I need to come in here. I need to look for Outlook. When an email arrives, for example, is what I want to use, and I want to use Office 365 Outlook for it. So I'm going to see more, and what I can see here, when it's flagged, when a new email arrives in a shared inbox, we'll use my email inbox for this, right? So you can see here, great. I've got some cool parameters I can set up that are related to this. I can specify the folder. We can see that it's connected to, it looks like my email here, which is fantastic. So when a new email arrives, we got our first part here. Easy peasy, right? All right, let's do our next action for this. So the next thing I want to do is I want to figure out now the content that's in that email to extract it to basically create a customer. Wait a second, how do I do that? Because now I've got the body of the email, but how do I decipher it? Well, you know what? Yeah, let's do this a little bit different. Let's use a little bit of AI inside of this process, right? Because once again, this could be a classical condition that you would want to tackle for it, because the inverse way to do that would be that you've got to do some complex like compose operation where you're going to then take, for example, the inbox or body basically of that email. And then you're going to have some type of loop or something like that that you're going to have to go through and basically iterate around, right? To basically build that out as part of it. So as you can see, this can get really complex. To go and look for keywords is what I would recommend to do it in a classical way to find what that field is. And then you got to add text string escape things and all these different things inside of this flow. So I'm not going to do that. Let's kind of bridge the hybrid gap here. Let's say, for example, that we're going to use AI to then provide that structure. Well, how could I do that? Well, I could use a little bit of AI to basically create a prompt, for example. And in that prompt, what I could do is get connected for it. And what we'll do is we'll use OAuth and we'll say classic test as an example and sign in. And what I can do is I'll sign in with my wonderful pre-sales organization. And what I should be able to do is build a new prompt inside of here. And what I could say is you will be presented with an email body that will contain the customer name, customer number, and also the customer description narrative. Please generate a JSON file that I can use to then populate my business system with those values. If they do not exist in the email, pass blank to the JSON string. Create a consistent result, right? So there we go. So copy that away, run it real quick, boom. It's going to come up with this amazing output. I just know it. And we're going to use the GPT 4.1 mini model to do it. So you can see here, customer number, customer name, customer description. That's going to be that. So if I keep that and then I'll test this real quick, I will say customer number 1234, customer name, Scott Frappier, description. I mean, misspell it, blah, 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 blah. right? All right, go ahead and close. We'll test that away just to see what happens. And basically what we're going to get here is that result. And as you can see, that was pretty dang quick, right? Like this is a very rapid approach then to basically using AI to do that, whereas I'd have to write tons of loops and code inside of Power Automate to it. So I'm cheating just a little bit here for the demonstration, but you can see then where this becomes fairly powerful, right? So now what I'll do is I'll hook up basically the compose output that's related to it. And what do I have to do next? Well, next thing I have to do is I basically have to go through and then update, let's say, Business Central. So what I would do is I would look for my Business Central connector that's inside of here. And then from there, what I would do is I would go ahead and maybe create a row, right? So if we go down to Business Central real quick, create a record. And then what I would do is I'd build a new connection to our Business Central instance. Let's hope I still have access to it in our pre-sales environment. And what we're going to see here then is that I should be able to then go through selected Business Central instance. We do our code in production. That's very facetious. It's not truly a production environment, even though it says it. And what I would do is I would go into Cronus, for example. We'll do large. And then what I would do is I would find the API for the table. So we're at V2 right now that we do with this. And I would then find the customers. And from there, inside of that record, what I would do is I would show the fields that are there, and I would start populating, for example, the values that come from the output, basically, of that particular prompt inside of here. Now, remember, team, like in the interest of time here, I'm kind of shortcutting this, right? Because I'm using AI, even though I'm using a classical process, for example, which what you're going to see here in a little bit as to why I did that. We'll kind of summarize it. But as you can see here, this is where I can then go ahead and then populate those values. But I'm not done yet, right? So I have to create an email as well. So how would I do that? Well, then I'd have to go ahead and then create, for example, another prompt inside of here to generate the content of the email so it builds out an email, or I got to set up a template. So if I did a template with it, what I could do is I could do Outlook again inside of here, and I could actually have it so it would then generate or create an email, right? Draft an email message, or even technically send an email with options as well inside of it. And what I can then do inside of here is define, well, who's the body, and I basically go through and build that out. Now, this will take a lot longer to build. I can pretty much guarantee this. But the advantage of this is that the consistent response of it, and if I take out the AI related to it, the consistent response, I can pretty much guarantee that it's always going to process in this way, shape, or form, because it is a flow, and we all know flows go through those actions. And there are events like the example would be, well, what happens if it fails inside of Business Central for creating it? Well, my argument would be you build scopes, right, inside of here to do what we call try, catch, finally. And once again, now I'm starting to introduce additional concepts inside of here that you're probably like, well, wait a Scott, what does all that mean? So once again, you've got to know a lot more from the tool builder perspective to do this action inside of your environment, but we can get it to 100% certainty every time. All right, let's flip the script now. Let's do this from an AI approach using Copilot Studio to tackle this. So in Copilot Studio, what I would do is let's even go the harder way of doing this. Let's build an agent without doing a description related to it. So what I would do is I'd click on my agent. I would say, I want to create a blank agent. That agent, I'm going to call this going to be our customer record creator. I'm going to go ahead and create it. Now, what I could also do, though, is change some of these settings dynamically inside of here, but we're just going to keep it simple just to start. So great, fantastic. I have an agent here now that's built that is going to allow me to kind of configure it to basically do the same action as to what I would have done in Power Automate here, but now do it inside of Copilot Studio. So first things first, just like inside of Power Automate, we need to have a condition or a trigger, as we call it, happen that basically takes the information from that email and brings it to the agent to process. Well, how do we do that? Well, after it creates this, what we do is we scroll down basically to our triggers and we click on the add trigger. And in the add trigger, what we do is we say, for example, when a new email arrives, and we click on next for it. And when that trigger is created inside of here, what we're going to do is define, for example, what the details are as to what needs to occur with that email. So if I click on next, I can say, well, what folder, just like we saw inside of Power Automate. So this is going to be my inbox. And I'm not going to make any other changes to this. I'm just clicking on my inbox experience, then creating that trigger. And then from there, now anytime an email comes to that inbox, it's basically going to be triggered to then inform this agent. Well, then how does the agent know what to do to basically go through and then process that same exact scenario that we had before? Well, instead of actually going through in that visual designer and changing everything, instead, what I want to do is I want to define the tools that it's going to use to get its job done, because it's an agent, it's autonomous, it has its own agency, meaning it can figure things out, and that's really important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my tools as an example, and I'm going to add two different tools inside of here. I'm going to go to our model context protocol, and I'm going to say, for example, that I want to go through and then update Business Central, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say Business Central and add that to configure it so it has a connection now to Business Central using whatever login information I want to define for that. What I also want to do from a tooling perspective, and I can go ahead and define, for example, the environment. So as you can see here, you can actually go ahead and select if you want to, or you can also have the agent potentially put in what those values are. So I'm still going to go ahead and then connect these different ones inside of here, define, for example, the MCP connection, and then even define, for example, maybe the company that I'm interacting with to really drive that, right? So you're still going to go through and do some setup inside of here and then save that away basically so that that agent now knows about this tool that can occur with it. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can add one other tool as well. And so I can come into my model context protocol again, excuse me, wrong button, model context protocol, and I could find, for example, my email management connection. And I could add and configure that, even though this is deprecated, we got a new one coming. But we can basically then use that to basically go through and let the agent know that, hey, you've got the ability to send emails as well inside of here as these tools as a part of it. I haven't defined the structure or the process flow or anything else like that to tackle it. Now, finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it what to do. I'm going to come into here in our instructions, and I'm going to say, you are an autonomous agent that is in charge of creating a customer inside of Business Central based on the content that comes from an email that will be what triggers you each time. Please go through and first off try to create the customer inside of Business Central using and I could, for example, do a reference to it. I could insert, for example. If I look around here just a little bit, I'll scroll down. But what you can do is inside of the instructions, you can say, for example, using a specific tool, for example, that you can define for it, or passing another agent or going to a specific topic. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this really simple. Please go through and first off, try to create a customer inside of Business Central using the Business Central MCP tool that you have. Populate all necessary fields. If you do not have the necessary fields, do not try to create the customer and respond to the email that was supplied as to why you cannot create the customer and what fields are missing, right? So I think you get the gist here. Instead of basically going through and defining step by step by step what needs to happen, instead I'm giving instructions that are related to it. Finally, send a failure or success email based on the errors that occurred. Make it highly impactful. Send the email to the original requester, and also send an email to scottf@stoneridgesoftware.com, right? So this is an example then if I click on save to that, this agent now, theoretically, if I have all the tooling and parameters set up, will start creating customers and sending emails, right? So this is the difference right here. For that particular need, as you can see, instead of going through and defining every single little step that needs to occur, instead, I built this customer record creator that gets passed an email that has tools that are related to it that it can then go ahead and take those particular actions. And by using the right model inside of here, this also further then makes it more accurate when you go through the process. But here's the big caveat. This sometimes may not work for your customer creation, whereas this might be 100% successful every single time. This, because maybe the agent gets an error message and it doesn't know how to recover from it, it doesn't have recoverability maybe in the same way, which means typically these types of scenarios may be 80 to 90% successful. But you can see how much faster it went. And now, if I've got other emails where there's different patterns inside of the structure that I couldn't use a regex for or a prompt around to do it, that's where then this particular Copilot Studio agent becomes more impactful for it. So once again, just to kind of highlight those differences, I want to kind of sum this up because I know we're at time, but I guess the key thing here is that when you want to use, for example, ERP automation, typically something that has high complexity inside of the process. It needs to impact, for example, just the business system, and you need that 100% success rate. You don't have multiple integration points. You don't want to generate large amounts of text, and the conditions can be set up and well structured, obviously, as well as we go through this. And then with AI automation, as you can see, when you have repeatable low complexity type scenarios where maybe you have multiple entrance points and they're kind of loose in terms of what that data is, and or you interact with a chat type experience where the agent has to go back and forth either via chat or email, these particular AI automations or AI agents make way more sense to do that as part of that. So once again, I'm going to leave this up for the wrap up here. One thing, Team Desai, wanted to mention is remember, we've got our April 22nd Stone Ridge Community Conference coming up here. Please, I know Bree just put it in the session here. Please feel free to register to get to more information. We're going to be covering obviously way more in terms of Copilot, as well as just all of the other dynamics capabilities. But remember, I think the key thing here, as you saw, is that while one or the other might be really good for your scenario, the power can also come from that blend like we were showing in the first example, where maybe you use some of the AI tools to take some of these tasks to make them go faster, but you don't use the full Copilot experience. And once again, there is no right or wrong way to do it. It just has to align to the business need. And once again, that goes beyond the technology to drive that. With that, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you on our next Flight Lab next month. Thank you.